What is the creepiest thing you've seen in the woods, or in the mountains, or in deserts, or caves, or in small towns, or in remote or rural areas, or while on large bodies of water, or while on an aircraft or a nautical vessel? Male Story 1. The smell of hay was like a ghost of the past, lingering where it didn't belong. Some days, I'd wake up in that room where the hayloft used to be, breathing it in, though there hadn't been a horse or a bale near the place in decades. It clung to the air, faint but stubborn. My dog wouldn't even step paw upstairs, not once. He'd stop at the bottom of the staircase, ears flat, tail tucked, and stare like something waited for him at the top. I didn't argue with him. I got it. The house made noise at odd hours. The front door, the side door, and the old stable door would all sound off with knocks, sometimes in unison, sometimes in rhythm, like they were playing some cruel joke. I'd check, of course. Always empty, always silent. But none of that compared to the night with the laughter. It started just past midnight. I had my window cracked, letting in the cool air and the soft hum of the woods. Crickets, the occasional owl, that sort of thing. The laugh didn't fit. It was sharp and light, unmistakably a child's giggle, and it came from above me, above my room. But there was nothing above my room but rafters and cobwebs. I bolted, the sound still ringing in my ears as I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The hallway stretched ahead, dim and empty, but my door was wide open. I knew I'd closed it. The window, too, had been latched before bed, but there it was, gaping into the night. The curtains billowed like something had been standing there just seconds ago. Then I saw it, movement in the garden below. A figure, small and fast, darting toward the tree line. It moved unnaturally, arms and legs too jerky, as if it didn't quite understand how to run. The giggle came again, quieter now, swallowed by the woods. My heart pounded, drowning out everything else. I slammed the window shut and stayed away from it for days. I didn't go looking. I didn't want to know what it was. I just lived with it. For 2 more years, I slept with my door locked and avoided the woods, but the unease never left. It was like the house had grown teeth, and I was stuck inside its jaws. Female Story 2, I remember the boat smelled of salt and mildew, like it hadn't been washed in years. My older brother and I had begged to go out alone, and after relentless whining, my parents gave in. "Stay close," Mom had said, wagging her finger at us before pointing at the orange blob bobbing in the distance. "And avoid the big floating thing." We nodded, but the moment the motor sputtered to life, we steered straight for it. We were kids, and being told not to do something meant we absolutely had to do it. As we got closer, the thing wasn't as bright as it looked from afar. The orange had faded, stained with what looked like streaks of rust or mud. It rocked gently, half submerged, and its edges weren't smooth, like a buoy should be. It looked wrong. I leaned over the edge of the boat as far as I dared, gripping the railing tight, while my brother killed the engine. We floated the last few feet. It wasn't rust. The smell hit first, a mix of rotting fish and something worse, something thick and sweet that stuck in the back of my throat. I gagged. My brother squinted at the waterlogged lump, his face twisted in confusion, and then we saw it. A hand. Bloated, pale, with the skin pulling away at the fingertips. It bobbed gently, fingers clawed as if reaching for something. My stomach churned. It was a man, or what was left of one. His face was swollen beyond recognition, lips barely covering his teeth. His eyes, they were gone, just black, hollow pits staring back at us. His body was tangled in some kind of harness, like maybe he'd been diving. Strips of fabric clung to him like seaweed, flapping with the water's movement. We didn't scream, we just stared, frozen. Then my brother grabbed the motor, yanked it to life, and we sped back so fast the boat nearly tipped. The police came later, and Mom didn't say, "I told you so," though I know she wanted to. They said he'd been missing a week, part of a group. The others were never found. Even now, the thought of open water makes my skin crawl. Female story 3. The woods felt like another world at night, the kind you step into and forget time exists. My boyfriend and I had climbed pretty far into the forest near his house, scaling steep sections and pushing through the brush. Midnight had rolled in quietly, leaving only the whispers of trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. The spot we found was a little clearing, surrounded by thick trunks and jagged rocks. No paths, no lights, no signs of anyone else around, just us and the stillness. The nearest trail was a good 5-minute climb down, and that was if you knew exactly where to go. We felt isolated, like we'd carved out a piece of the night for ourselves. We'd been kissing, lost in the moment, when my boyfriend froze. His head jerked to the side, eyes locking on something in the shadows about 25 feet away. It was faint, just a flicker of movement. A shadow shifted along the slope, then stopped. My boyfriend barely whispered, "Be careful," before we both spotted it. A figure, dark and wiry, scaling the incline. The man moved weirdly, not clumsy, but deliberate. His path wasn't straight, he climbed diagonally, edging closer but staying slightly out of sight. Then he stopped again, directly above us, maybe 15 feet up. The angle was steep, trees and loose rocks between us and him, but he turned, facing downhill, and started descending toward us. No hesitation. My boyfriend grabbed my wrist and we bolted. The slope was brutal, the kind where your feet slip and you hope momentum keeps you upright. Branches slapped our arms and rocks rolled underfoot, but we didn't stop. The sound of him crashing through the forest behind us was unmistakable. Heavy footsteps, fast and closing in. My chest burned and my legs felt like they might give out, but we couldn't slow down. The path came into view like a lifeline. We hit it running, not stopping even then. The trees thinned out, and the glow of streetlights broke the darkness. The basketball courts and the cafe came into view, and with them people, normal, safe, blissfully unaware people. The crashing behind us stopped. We didn't look back. Once we'd caught our breath, we just sat there, under the streetlights, letting the reality sink in. Never again. Male story 4. It was the kind of night that smelled like damp leaves and wood smoke, the air thick enough to taste. My dad's place in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky, had always felt like stepping into another world, a quieter one, where the stars looked like they might spill out of the sky. I liked visiting, but it was a different vibe, one that crept into your bones if you let it. That night, I was crashing at his place for the weekend. Around 10, my dad got one of those sudden cravings only a greasy McDonald's burger could fix. He wasn't one to plan ahead. When he wanted something, he just got up and did it. He grabbed his keys, slipped on his old boots, and said, "Let's go." As usual, he insisted on leading. I didn't question it, just figured it was his thing, like how he'd always tell me to wear gloves when handling firewood, even though he never did. He swung open the screen door, and the porch light threw out this weak, yellow glow. The second he stepped outside, though, something changed. This sound came out of nowhere, slicing through the quiet so fast I actually flinched. It started as this high-pitched screech, sharp enough to hurt, then dropped into a series of crow calls. Except it wasn't a crow. It was too off. The rhythm, the tone, it was like someone had taken a crow sound and twisted it into something almost human. I froze, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. It was wrong, all wrong. My dad, who never flinched at anything, not snakes, not storms, stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't step forward, didn't even turn his head toward the sound. He just stepped backward, slow and steady, and pulled the door shut like he didn't want to make a noise. Then, with a deliberate click, he locked it. I didn't think I'd ever seen him lock a door in my life. "Not tonight," he said, his voice low and clipped. The rest of the night, the house was a fortress. My dad didn't even crack the door for a smoke. He let the outside dogs in, which felt stranger than anything else. Those dogs weren't allowed inside. Ever. They slunk into the living room, tails tucked, like they knew better than to bark. The house felt like it was holding its breath. By morning, it was like nothing had happened. We drove to town, got the burgers, and never said a word about the night before. But I still hear that sound in my head sometimes, and every time I do, it feels like a warning I'm too late to understand. Mayo Story 5. The mountain air felt sharp, biting at my face as the last light bled out of the sky. Tyler had gotten his elk, a solid bull, and we stood over it in the thickening dusk. The rifle shot echoed minutes ago, but now the only sound was the rhythmic rasp of Tyler's knife as he worked on the carcass. The stench of blood was everywhere, hanging heavy in the air. Then the howls started, low, far off at first, barely cutting through the quiet. Tyler muttered something under his breath, quickened his pace, and I clutched the mini maglite like it was a lifeline. The howls multiplied, cascading into a haunting chorus. They were getting closer, the sound weaving tighter around us. Darkness closed in fast. My beam of light barely pierced the night, catching fleeting glints of movement. Shadows flickered at the edges of the light's reach, and then they were gone. Tyler's hat bill light bobbed up and down, the white beam harsh against the crimson-streaked elk hide. The wolves didn't wait long. The first one darted in, a streak of fur and teeth. It lunged low, aiming for the elk, and vanished just as quickly. My heart slammed in my chest as I swung the light wildly, catching a fleeting glimpse of its retreat. They circled us. I could hear the crunch of their paws on the frosty ground, the snarl of their breaths as they darted closer with every pass. Tyler worked in frantic silence, his knife moving like his life depended on it, and maybe it did. Every so often, a wolf got bold, its eyes flashing in the light, before it snapped at the elk's leg or pawed the ground near us. Finally, Tyler stepped back, wiping his hands on his pants. The elk was dressed and quartered, its remains surrounded by a crude scent circle he'd scraped out. It might keep them distracted, or not. Either way, we couldn't stay. We hefted our packs, slippery with blood, and started the 3-mile hike back. Every step felt like bait in the water. The wolves followed, their yelps sharper now, echoing through the pines. I didn't dare turn my light off, catching glimpses of their shapes just outside the beam. We didn't stop moving, not once. Mail Story 6. The wind on the Bering Sea bites. It chews through layers of wool and canvas, relentless. I leaned against the galley's doorframe, a mug of bitter coffee steaming in my hands, watching the gray expanse roll and swell. The waves were jagged, almost alive, and the ship groaned with every crest it climbed. I was stealing a break from the clamor of stainless steel pots and knives clinking on cutting boards. My hands smelled like garlic and onions, a smell I'd scrubbed at but couldn't shake. Outside, the horizon was a smear of cloud and sea. No birds, no land, nothing but a boundless void stretching forever. Then I saw it, 2 nautical miles out, give or take. It broke the surface fast, like it had been waiting under the waves and decided now, a massive triangle. Not a fin, not debris. This thing was smooth, deliberate, almost too clean to be part of the wild chaos around it. It rose just enough for the black, gleaming surface to catch the dim sunlight filtering through the clouds. And then it dove as if the ocean had simply swallowed it whole. No splash, no churn, nothing dramatic. It vanished so neatly it made me doubt I'd seen it at all. But I had. I know because I stood there, coffee cooling in my grip, eyes pinned to the spot like the sea would give up its secret. It didn't. The waves carried on, indifferent, like they'd erased it. The cook in me wanted to head back, let the sight evaporate in the rhythm of chopping and seasoning. But my legs didn't move. I stayed at that door for what felt like hours, though it was probably minutes, staring at the place where the water folded over itself again and again. Later, I thought about it in pieces, the angles, the way it felt too perfect for the stormy nothingness out there. How it wasn't natural, wasn't something I could tie to a story or a fact I'd heard before. I didn't talk about it. Who would believe a cook with hands that still smelled like garlic? Even now, when I think about it, I taste that cold, metallic air. The way the Bering Sea doesn't care if you're there or if something else is. Male story 7. It was one of those early autumn evenings where the sky feels too bright for the time, like it doesn't know when to quit. I was 10, running drills at the football pitch with my cousins, all of us tired but riding that post-practice energy. Our parents weren't due for another half hour, so we wandered off, following the canal path nearby. The towpath was uneven and packed with weeds, the kind of place you don't really notice until you've got time to kill. It smelled faintly of damp, with the occasional hint of dead fish wafting up from the water. We joked about how gross it looked, the green scum bobbing along the edges, but none of us strayed too close. Well, except Danny. He always had to poke at everything. Danny stopped suddenly, pointing down at something caught in the water. "Look at that!" he shouted, excitement in his voice. Floating there was a thick jacket, like one of those expensive puffer ones you'd see in store windows. Danny, being Danny, crouched right at the edge of the path, gripping a branch he'd snapped off earlier, and leaned over to hook it. "Bet it's worth something," he muttered, dragging it closer. The jacket snagged on the branch, turning slowly in the water. At first I thought it was stuffed with mud, the way it sank oddly, but then it rolled just enough for us to see the face, or what should have been one. It wasn't there. The skin was gone, like someone had scraped it clean. No eyes, no nose, just a warped mess of raw flesh and blackened patches. The water lapped lazily against it, rocking the body as if it were still alive. There was no sound. No screaming, no splashing, just Danny dropping the branch and stumbling back, his face frozen in that strange, open-mouthed panic. I don't know how long we stood there. Long enough for the jacket to drift back toward the center of the canal, the head tilting to one side like it was trying to look at us. Then we ran. None of us said a word. When the adults picked us up, we didn't mention the body. Danny stayed silent the whole way home. The canal path stayed empty after that. None of us ever walked it again. Male story 8. The Cowlitz River in the early 90s was a hell of a place to camp. Rugged, wild, and quiet, except for the rush of water and the occasional coyote howling in the distance. We set up camp right where the tree line broke. My dad, my sister, and a couple of my buddies. The kind of trip where you eat charred hot dogs and tell dumb jokes until the fire burns low. The first sign that the night wouldn't go as planned came when the first rock skittered into our camp. Not a pebble. It had weight behind it, a solid thunk as it bounced off the cooler. We stopped mid-conversation, all of us looking at each other. Then another rock, smaller but just as deliberate, landed near the fire pit. My dad's face tightened. He wasn't the jumpy type, but you could tell he was already sizing up the situation. Then came the sticks. They weren't hurled with force, more like tossed, like whatever was out there was just trying to get our attention. The forest seemed too still, like even the bugs had decided this wasn't their fight. My buddy handed my dad the flashlight, the big mag light we always kept handy. He clicked it on and swept it through the trees. That's when we saw them, eyes. Low at first, like whatever it was had crouched behind the underbrush. Then it rose, slow, deliberate, until it stood tall. Too tall. The beam caught the faint outline of a figure, broad-shouldered and impossibly upright, its eyes reflecting the light back like two small mirrors. My dad didn't flinch. He turned off the light, tossed another log on the fire, and started stoking it hard. We followed his lead, feeding flames until they roared and threw shadows against the trees. Whatever it was didn't leave right away. The rocks kept coming, but slower, like it was deciding something. Then silence, just the crackling fire and the river beyond. At dawn, the smell hit first. Wet dog, rotten vegetation, and something acrid, like sulfur. Heavy footsteps padded through the camp, slow and deliberate. My dad, wide awake now, slapped the side of the tent hard, shouting like hell itself was about to charge. There was a snarl, then the sound of something crashing through the brush. By the time we stepped out, it was gone, but the tracks it left behind weren't. Too big to be a bear, too strange to be anything else.